So hello, all you out there coming in and watching us on Silver Lining for Learning. This is our first show with guests in the new year. Last week was a reflection among the hosts. And what a lineup of guests we have for you, because Chris, Young, and Punya went all out during the past week and filled the shows up during the next couple of months. And I'll take over in March and April and get some people in global education for episode 100. But right now, we have a very special moment in the show, because do you know that today is the 666th day of this show? And I got a t-shirt today just in honor of the show today. And I'll put it on for this show. It is also my 666th day of running in a row, so I know what day it is.
I love the product
day
placement,
667.
I'm going to have a can of Coke next time so that I can make a few bucks off the show here.
The devil made me do it. So what better than to have a team with us, 4 people from UC Boulder, one of the greatest campuses in the world. What a brilliant campus that is. I love every moment I get to spend, every second at that place. And we have people who have been involved in youth activism, which is an important topic today, and getting inquiry models involved in project-based learning to get students excited and engaged in their own learning. Instead of worrying about COVID-related learning loss, today we'll focus on learning gains during the pandemic, which has been important to us. It's really the reason why the show even exists, because we wanted to show that learning is possible in these difficult times. And we have the 4 people with us today. Ben Kirshner is going to lead the way, and he'll introduce the other guests, but he's been involved at Boulder previously, I guess, in San Francisco, in the market district of San Francisco, working with youth there. But he's a co-PI for the research hub at UC Boulder, faculty director at CU Engage, and he'll tell us a bit about what that is. But he says he's lucky to get to collaborate with youth in his work. And his books have won awards. And he's got a book series, I think, with Information Age Publishing, which you might tell us about as well, on youth and education. But he's got a book on youth activism in terms of educational inequality, in an era of educational inequality. So maybe he can hold the book up at some point during the show. But B and Arturo and Carlos will jump in as well. Ben, you want to introduce the other guests and find a little more about what and we found out about you through EdSurge, so you can tell us what EdSurge article is all about, and people can read that. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction. It's a real honor to be here. Thanks to the whole team of hosts or co-hosts for the show. We're excited to be here. So thanks for inviting us to be on. And what we'll do is we'll each just briefly introduce ourselves, and then we'll talk about kind of what brought us together for this work around supporting youth activism and kind of social justice leadership. And then we'll kind of move into a little bit about what we found out about learning gained. We'll do all that pretty fast. And then, so we have a lot of time for questions. So that's the thing. So yeah, hi everybody. My name is Ben Kirshner. I am at CU Boulder. I come to this work with a strong interest in how young people can both have opportunities to critically ask questions about their surroundings, identify assets and strengths in their traditions and in their communities, and then also work together with each other and caring adults to transform their schools and communities. So that's the kind of work I've been doing for many years, and it's a real honor to be here, and we look forward to talking about it with you more. I'll turn it over to Beatrice.
Hi, everybody. How's it going? My name is Beatrice. Most people just call me B or Beat because they can't say that, and I'm totally fine with that. It works 1000%. I am a doc student over at CU Boulder. Actually, Dr. Kirshner and Dr. Cortez are my advisors. And I am particularly interested in studying failure. And the question that brought me into graduate school was who has the social capital to fail, and kind of the learning that stems from that. And kind of hoping to give everybody that opportunity to learn and grow from learning gone wrong. Or maybe it was learning gone right the whole time and they just didn't know it. So I'm really curious about all of those pieces. And I have the wonderful opportunity to get to work with the students over in Denver, and then also get the students, get the opportunity to work with some students over in Boulder. That's a little bit about me.
Hi, buenas tardes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arturo Cortex. I'm an assistant professor of teacher learning, research and practice, and learning sciences and human development at CU Boulder. I'm just really interested in supporting young people and teachers in examining the ethical and the socio-political possibilities in everyday technology use. So I've lately been studying video gameplay as a space of collective inquiry between teachers and young people. And as we know, video gameplay has exploded during the pandemic. So really excited to talk further about that. Carlos.
Buenas tardes. Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Hipolito-Delgago. I am a professor at CU Denver. I'm the odd person out. I don't get to hang out in Boulder. But I primarily study the socio-political development of youth, how young folks come to see themselves as powerful civic actors and use their voice to transform and impact their schools and community. When I'm not doing that, I also study cultural competence in counselors. Thanks for having us, and I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we came together and way back when, like back in 2010, it was Carlos and a colleague of ours named Shelley Zion, who's at Rowan University. She's a sociologist of education. And so Carlos, Shelley, and I came together because we shared a value around student voice and agency. And each in our own way, we had arrived at a similar kind of conclusion about the tremendous lost opportunity for schools, for educators, for students, that we don't take advantage of their brilliance in the way we really design schools and the kind of the deep DNA of American public high schools in particular. And we started doing work with teachers and schools to support what we call transformative student voice. And you might ask, why transformative? Why do we need that word in front of it? And as we've done this work over the years, it became so important because the term student voice means so many different things to different people, but you'd be surprised at how sort of tiny the student voice, or how little student voice can actually mean in some context. Like it might just mean, oh, let's ask students to tell us what they think about a new policy we've already, put into place. Or it might be a classroom where students get to talk, all really important. But when we talk about transformative student voice, we're really talking about first opportunities for all students. So not just kind of the highest achieving students, but really students who experience marginalization in their school. All students to participate in asking questions about their school, critiquing what's going on and what's right and what's not right, and really participating in efforts to transform their schools. And we've seen some terrific examples of transformative student voice in Denver. We see students sitting on hiring committees for teachers. We see student teams leading professional development in partnership with teachers. We see students developing, co-designing curriculum. There's many more examples I could share, but we've had the great opportunity to partner with a group that really tries to encourage and foster youth adult partnerships in the schools, and with a strong social justice and ethnic studies orientation. So very much attending to the traditions and cultural practices of the students and their families, but also with an orientation towards social change to create more justice for their educational experience. We were doing a study, like so many of us, we're doing our study, our typical thing, 2 years ago, or whenever it was. I think it would have been in February, March of 2019, perhaps. And maybe it was 20.
2020.
Thank you so much. Yes, 20. And we had a relationship. We'd already been in the school and working with these students for about 2 years. And that's when the pandemic happened. I think we all can remember that. Late February, early March is when it really accelerated. Schools were closed for several weeks while they figured out what to do. And then school went remote. Now, during that time, we definitely faced some ethical questions like, do we just kind of back off and, let things settle for a while? Or do we check in with the teachers and students and see if they'd want to talk? And we really wanted to hear from the students because we'd been in a relationship with them for a couple of years, see how they're doing. We certainly didn't want to pressure anybody, but we felt really grateful that a lot of students and teachers did want to talk to us during that time. In fact, for some, they had actually a lot of extra time on their hands. And so we were able to do interviews with about 26 students who were part of this program, which was much larger. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bea, who's just going to give us a little taste of some of the things we learned, and then we'll kind of, again, open it up to more of a conversation and questions. But this is how highlighted in the article that led to us being invited to this, which is in EdSurge, which is an online education journal, which is just a terrific source of information. And turn it over to you, Bea.
That's good, because Bea, I was just going to ask you to do that, exactly what he's setting you up for, because when I read the article, they talk about kids getting involved in the stock market, getting involved in gardening, getting involved in learning languages, learning how to cook, conducting research. I guess that was a big thing, was everyone's conducting their own research. You want to expand on that and tell us more?
Absolutely. And so as we were kind of digging into the data and looking at the questions and really seeing what did the students have to say when we were going through all of these questions or through all of their answers. And one of the big pieces was like, wow, they did a lot and they learned so much. And so we started to see some themes, and it really also helped us challenge those assumptions that we were seeing of this narrative of learning loss. And it was like, wow, like, is it really a learning loss? Because our students are telling us so much, and they're engaging in learning, and they're curious, and they want to continue to learn. It's not like school ended and they're on vacation. It's like school went on a break while teachers figured out what was going on. And the students were given the opportunity to follow their heart, to follow their curiosity, to explore new pieces of their identities, or maybe some old pieces that had been there and there wasn't enough time. And so we talked about it in the article, but we broke it down into 3 different themes. And so one of the pieces that we saw was making the familiar strange. And so we had the students who were now at home, and now this, like, there's school, but now like it's school at home and it's in front of my bed, and like I'm helping my family. And so it was like all of these different pieces. And now this home that used to be this like thing that you do away from school now became another place, like another learning place. And so we titled that Making the Familiar Strange, of like this thing that used to be common to us is now not so common. And we're trying to figure out what that means and making sense of it all. The next thing that we came up with was, or that we noticed, was seeing student ingenuity. And so really seeing where students were curious. And so, as you said, we talked about a student who picked up and started learning cryptocurrency and was interested in the stock market. And we had some of our students like learning how to garden. We had a student who really was able to dig into the history of Denver and explore their own roots. And how that connected to the history of Denver through Chicano activism and Chicano history, or Chicanx history, I should say. And that was, I think for us, that was one of the coolest pieces of acknowledging, wow, students are learning so much and nobody is capturing it. We're only hearing this like narrative of learning loss. And it was students of color. And that was something that really we saw as devastating, of if the only narrative being told of students coming from low SES backgrounds, low socioeconomic status backgrounds, and students of color is negative, we're going to continue to perpetuate some stereotypes that aren't necessarily true, and that can be refuted through some of the things that we were learning and observing. And then last but not least, the other piece that we saw, and that was pretty huge, was family responsibilities as a resource for learning. And I think this was something that, again, was told in a very negative light, like, oh, students have to help their siblings and they're taking away time from their own. But it was like, we saw students really learning how to time manage and how to care for others and how to really learn how to be a part of a community and contribute to their families, honestly and truly contribute to their families, and then being able to take a step back and say like, yeah, I'm doing all of these things. And it was really awesome and fascinating to see. And we just wanted to shed a light on all of these pieces and all of the learning that was really going on, because we felt that it was an unfair narrative and very much a one-sided narrative. And we kind of wanted to propose a different perspective on it.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to have Young jump in first, and then Chris is going to go in, and then I have something for you too, and I'm sure Punya does as well. So Young, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just thank you guys for this. I wrote an article a while back called "Avoid the Learning Loss Trap." So that was a while back. I wrote that, and So I completely agree and endorse and support whatever you guys have been doing. My question really has to do with how the society. So when they were talking about learning loss, they're talking about specifically not being able to learn what's been prescribed in the curriculum. So said, we lost, 3 years of math, half a year of language, and it's of course silly and stupid, but at the same time, that kind of is prevalent in a conversation and discourse. So I was just wondering, your argument that the students have gained instead of actually have lost so much learning, and how does that, really go out? I mean, how is your finding accepted by school administrators, parents, and teachers, and even actually students? Do they feel like they're learning something that schools endorse and support? Or have you guys even asked that question?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a very important one. And I also think it's something that we should really think about as a lifelong question for those of us who kind of work in the field of education. It's something that we're constantly trying to battle against, right? It's the constant battle between the privileging disciplinary knowledge or privileging everyday knowledge that occurs outside of school. And I think it's really it emerges from this age-old question around how we view learning. And I think we have such a narrow view of learning in our public discourse, but also sometimes in our educational field, that learning really happens within the confines of the schooling environment. And it's not like, as Beatrice mentioned before, it's not like learning suddenly stopped when young people stopped going to school in person. I think the question, and this is the question that really we're trying to play with here, is what forms of learning emerged in this moment? And I think that your question, Young, is fascinating because it asks us, well, how can we use these insights from what we learned in the pandemic to support school administrators, parents, teachers, and perhaps students in seeing that there are valued everyday practices that occurred outside of that occur outside of school and that occurred during the pandemic. And one of the things that we've been really focusing in on is trying to think about learning expansively. What new relationships perhaps emerged during the pandemic? Beatrice provided us with some exciting examples. Also, what new ecologies were formed? And what kinds of collaborations were brokered during the pandemic? And I think that what happens is when we have this very narrow conception of learning, that it only occurs within schools, we continue to bracket out the valued practices that young people are engaged in when we don't think about ways that we can really combine the academic with the everyday. What kinds of possibilities will emerge when we start to do that work? And one thing that I've been focused on in my work is that young people have continued to iterate on some of the rich practices that they engaged in prior to the pandemic, and they've been leveraging them. So one in particular is video game play. And young people have been playing a lot of video games, as well as adults. And relationships have emerged across geopolitical boundaries, across gender, race. They've opened up new opportunities for collaboration in ways that we never even thought possible. So think about at the height of the global of the social rebellions in summer 2020. And this was, of course, during the pandemic. We witnessed young people actually engaging in hacking video games for their own purposes. They were staging memorials and protests in games like Grand Theft Auto. And these are really important ways of thinking about learning, right? You're building with others across geopolitical boundaries. You're helping, you're pushing on the confines of what a socio-political space could be and where activism can occur. So I think your question is wonderful, Young, because it asks us to really think intentionally, how are we going to support folks and thinking about how to see and leverage young people's valued and everyday practices. So thanks for that question. It's beautiful.
So I'll jump in. One of the things that's very ironic about education is that we're about helping people reach their full potential. And yet almost everything that we apply is a deficit model of some kind. Deficit models for people who've been marginalized and deficit models for young people in general. If they're not sitting at a desk in a classroom in front of a teacher, they're incapable of learning. And of course, what your project is documenting is absolutely the opposite. But it's hard to get people out of these deficit models because, they're a power dynamic. I think that one of the things that might be productive for you to look at would be dispositions. We tend to think about learning as learning knowledge and learning skills, but if there's anything that the pandemic is teaching us, it's how important people's dispositions are, their willingness to use those knowledge and skills that they have. And with the deficit model, people are taught to have a passive set of dispositions and to wait for authority to somehow rescue them, which is the last thing we need. And what your research is documenting is that students are showing resilience, they're showing tenacity, they're being entrepreneurial, they have a growth mindset about themselves. And that's exactly what we should be doing. So the real learning loss may be putting them back in classrooms with a deficit model and an emphasis on passive dispositions. That may be the learning loss.
Any comments on that?
I was going to say, one of the things that I found really fascinating in going through our interviews was the amount of times students said, but this isn't like school learning, or like, this isn't like real learning. And they labeled it themselves of like, this is not real learning, because it was something that was really of interest to them. And it was something that they wanted to engage in. And they're like, but we don't like talk about these things in the classroom. And it's really interesting because it's like, why not? Why aren't these things talked about in the classroom? These are skills and tools that can help students succeed and move forward. And not just students, right? Like people. What if we learned to explore curiosity in our lives? What if we learned to ask those whys a little bit more and take away some of that taboo from the why questions and take away some of that negativity that comes when people do ask why? So fascinating.
Punya?
Okay, so thank you. This is super exciting, as you can tell from the responses from the other hosts. So Ben, I want us to step back a little bit. So Ben, you spoke about that this was part of this larger project where we are looking at student agency and so on. So I think that this group of students were, I'm assuming, already part of that process. So just like Chris suggested, that we have this deficit model. The other thing is that we very often make these attributions to the individuals, right? So these students did the following. But to me, what's always interesting is what are the structural or the systemic supports that allowed these things to happen, right? Why is it that the broader narrative around learning loss and so on is happening? Because I think people are also seeing that a lot of kids are not doing much. So my question then, what was unique or special, or was there nothing, in the structural space, not in unique in the kids? The kids are kids, but there is something that's in the broader support. I don't even know apart from saying sort of systems and structures and context, that allowed for what you guys were seeing. And I'd love to hear that, because to me, that's what is truly transferable. That students, if given the right support and structures and so on, are going to be curious, that they are going to want to learn. I mean, we have evolved to do that. We have evolved to extend our childhood till we are 20 plus years of age so that we can play and learn. We've had a couple of episodes around play and learning and sort of the evolutionary lineage that leads to that. But the sad thing is that despite that evolutionary lineage, we have formed structures that prevent that from happening. So I would love to hear a little bit about, from whoever wants to take it, or all of you, about what was going on before that allowed this to continue, and what can we take away from that? Because to me, that's the biggest learning. It's not that kids are curious or they love to play and they love to learn, but there are certain contexts within which they feel that they're allowed to do that, that it is valued, that this is something that is good and okay or fun or whatever that may be. Anyway, I think you get the broader point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I love it. I appreciate the way you're framing it too. You're not asking sort of what was special or different about these kids, but what was it about like you said, the system or the ecosystem or the ecology around these students. So I'll say a couple of things, and then I think my colleagues will want to add something as well. And And this is where I want to give a shout out to the teachers who worked with the students that we interviewed, because while we certainly there's a deep kind of critique of conventional, schooling in the United States, high schooling in particular here, that students are articulating and that we're kind of echoing. We don't want to extend that to their teachers who are just really dedicating themselves to this work. And to answer your question, Punya, I think one of the factors was that students who happened to be participating in this program that was distributed across about 25 high schools. So it was pretty widely distributed across the district, but not all the high schools by any means, because it's a big district. Really were going out of their way to try to connect with the students who were part of this social justice student leadership program. And so they were finding ways to connect, outside of the confines of a typical class experience. They were adjusting. They also happened to be teachers really dedicated themselves to finding ways to work more collaboratively with students and create kind of norms and routines where their students had more agency within their projects. And last but not least, the group we were studying, when this all happened, they were right at the sort of tail end of youth participatory action research projects, what we often call YPAR projects, where they were getting ready to share these policy narratives that they had written or were in the process of writing, making arguments about changes they wanted to see at their schools or in their districts. So they were part of a kind of, I guess I'll call it a learning community, or maybe you could call it an ecology of educators and students who are working on something that had a culminating set of activities that were going to be happening in April and March. But I do think that provided some glue for those students in particular. But I don't think it explains what they were telling us about some of the things they were doing on their own. But I don't know, I want to turn it over to Carlos, who has a lot of insight on this question too.
Well, part of it, we have to look at the program structure that they're involved with, right? They're involved with this program that's nurturing critical thought, that's creating a space for leadership opportunities, that's nurturing, sense of ethnic self, right? So one of the things we've continually found with these students is they have a high sense of efficacy. They believe in themselves. And that's because they've been given opportunities, as Bea mentioned earlier, to try and be leaders. Right? Whether that's in the class, and I'm not even talking about big leadership opportunities like, their student council president. No, they've ran a discussion inside of a classroom, right? Or they were a spokesperson for their group at a district event. So they've gotten these leadership opportunities and they've come to feel powerful. So this idea that learning happens passively, that they're involved with the banking method of education where a teacher's depositing knowledge, that's not their reality. They go out and they develop and they seek knowledge, right? So I think that's a big piece about that context, and this high level of efficacy has led them to believe that, yes, absolutely, they've got the agency and the power to impact their learning and to impact their communities as well.
So Carlos,
Thank you.
I'm sorry if anyone wants to jump in. So Carlos and Bea, you both use the term word agency. So you're also talking about the students are in leadership positions, no matter what kind of leadership. So I'm actually working quite a lot on that. I was just wondering if you have any suggestions, recommendations to give agency to all students to cultivate that, because we know once you enter high school, typically in 6th, 7th grade, students become disengaged. They really become to do their own thing. They may pretend to be in school. They can fool the teachers to make you feel happy. But really, so you see a lot of students. I've also worked with schools where when they try to give students agency after 9th grade, a lot of students are not interested in that. So I would love to hear how if you try that, or you are only getting students who have agencies, who have developed a sense of self-determination to do this, or are you trying to also create opportunities to help the students develop the capacity?
I can get us started, Bea, if you'd like, and then if you want to jump in, you can jump in as well. We recently had an article published in Urban Education that kind of speaks to that agentic component. One of the things we're really interested in is, again, student voice. How do we grow powerful civic actors, right? How do we foster that? And our research, it's relatively simple, it seems. And it's giving students that opportunity. That leadership component is absolutely crucial in that. The second piece, though, this takes a little more work, activist training. Teach students how to be activists, what makes for successful activism and voice. Teach them how to run through this civic action process, right? These things seem to be kind of key components in that. Now, the other end of that is the critical thinking skills. And how do we develop the critical thinking skills? One of the things that seems to be key there is that ethnic sense of self, the degree to which the students understand themselves as cultural beings. And I mean, part of that's kind of logical, right? If part of understanding yourself as cultural being is understanding difference and understanding that I may not be represented in that kind of dominant discourse. So that seems to be kind of key on it. Now, some of this is based on some really fun quant research that I'm sure you don't want to get into right now. And we need some deeper kind of qualitative stuff to really pull out some of that nuance. But I'll put in the chat box a quick citation to that article in case other folks are interested as well.
I think the other piece to that is, can I curse on this show? Is it okay?
It's okay. Yeah, I have before.
All right, gotta make sure. I think students can tell when they're getting bullshitted, right? Like when when adults want that stamp of approval from a student, but they've created the whole thing and they created the whole plan, and they just want to say, "Hey, students, like yay or nay," but really it's like a hidden yes. Versus when students are given the opportunity to create something for themselves. I've had the amazing opportunity to follow students for, I think, a year and a half now, and they're doing big things. And one of their biggest pieces is they're setting boundaries on how adults engage with their project. And they are not afraid to say like, hey, you're overstepping your bounds. Like, this is our thing and we kind of want to approach it. And it's messy. And as somebody who's, in this all the time, I'm kind of like, dang, like, what if you did this, this, and this? And it's one of those things where it's like, one, I'm observing, right? So I can't really like jump in. Sometimes I do, if if I feel like, I don't think that researcher observant boundary should always be there. That's not why I came into research. Or it's not why I came into my doctorate degree, but I think it's also that piece of like, this is their process, they're learning. And as Carlos said, like that critical thinking, that's really important, because as somebody who's worked with so many college students, that's hard when students get into my office or step into my classroom and I'm like, what about this? And they're like, well, I don't know, what does school say? Or like, I don't know, my teacher never taught me how to do this. I'm like, wow, what if we stepped away from that? What if we helped students think about how to think and learn how to think and how to think for themselves? And I think that's also another really big piece of the program. And I applaud our students for.
I love that, Beatriz.
Before Arturo jumps in here, just can I get a clarification? Is this a network of universities working together on this project? I see UC Berkeley in here somewhere. When people look up what's going on here with the youth participatory action research, are there a number of universities in the network trying this out as well?
Very briefly, not sure. Well, we'll share a couple of links. It just so happens that the work we've been talking about today is very much rooted in Colorado. Okay. But there are universities, including at Berkeley, who have faculty working on youth participatory action research. So certainly, but there it is happening in different parts of the world. But what we're talking about today is very much located in Colorado, and a collaboration between Denver and Boulder campuses. Over to you, Arturo.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to summarize just what I was thinking about in terms of Punya's powerful question, and also the question around agency. And I think first and foremost, we're not in a position to give agency or to give voice to young people. They already have it. And the question really is just like, how do we intentionally design learning environments to support the emergence, not only of the individual agency, but of the collective agency? And I think that I always ask myself, how can I as a teacher be in solidarity with young people? What kinds of questions can we ask together? And the pandemic allowed us to really engage with that. Teachers started to reimagine schooling. They started to dig deep in new ways to think about the relationships that they can have with young people. And because we're in a profound moment, not one person in the world right now has an answer to how to resolve this complex societal global dilemma that we find ourselves in. And we have to work together. And that's a really interesting place to think about with respect to learning. Teachers have to work with young people. That's a powerful question. And I think that, with this question around systems, you have to think about that, Punya. I think one of the amazing things about this system that existed pre-pandemic is that it failed. There's this vast apparatus that has been created to monitor and surveil students, and it failed. And that's exciting. We should think about, Beatriz asked us to think about failure as an area of inquiry. This system failed. And that's really, really cool because it opened up opportunities for kids and teachers, as Ben offered earlier, to engage in intergenerational forms of learning. Kids had a chance to opt into new ways of learning. They also had a chance to opt out. They could turn their cameras off. They could choose to not participate in schools. They could be out of the watchful eye of authority. And these systems, just to reiterate, these systems that have been constructed to monitor and surveil students failed, and that's exciting.
We have a couple quick, Chris, were you going to say something?
Well, I want to take the conversation in a little different direction. So if you have some things that are follow-throughs, then I can wait.
Yeah, I have one thing real quick. I just want to point out that 15 months ago, we had a group from Nepal of kids who are learning during the pandemic from massive open online courses, particularly learning English skills to get ready for college, and then shooting off into dozens and dozens of other ones on their own at home, and then showing each other what they're doing. And their teachers were giving them, putting them on leaderboards, and they were getting certificates from an embassy in Nepal, the U.S. Embassy in Nepal. And there were multiple factors that got some kids so excited, enthusiastic for learning. And the parents were worried the kids are going to, I'm sorry, Arturo, they're worried their kids are going to play games, and they weren't playing games. They were taking courses, all sorts of courses. So I've done research with these because I've interviewed a dozen or more and their teachers and so forth. I'm in the midst of this, writing it up. And we just submitted a grant looking at what are the community components? What are the components that made this effective and engaging and sustainable and might be replicable in other disadvantaged youth areas in other parts of the world? What things? And you've mentioned three things that made this somewhat successful. I guess the pre-pandemic planning, but the leadership role, the activism training, and the focus on critical thinking skills. Are there other components? Were they learning individually, or were they learning as a community? Were they sharing with other of their peers? And the kids in Nepal were younger. I think they're like from 9 to 15, somewhere 16 and 17. It sounds like most of yours are in high school, and about maybe like juniors or seniors, or sophomores, juniors, seniors. So maybe some of the behavioral components that were in place in the Nepal program wouldn't work so well with slightly older students. So what were the kinds of other mechanisms that were in place that I might want to think about when I'm working with these Nepal kids?
I might ask Kurt, when you say what kind of mechanisms in place, can you just say a little more? Do you mean like what was it about the educational setting, or was it about their homes, or can you say a little more? What
psychological principles? What would you say in terms of, you mentioned identity, self-efficacy as a learner was critical, and that was same and true in Nepal. What feedback mechanisms? What sharing mechanisms? What recognition mechanisms? Was there, were there any things that you could label?
Yeah, I'll say a couple things, but I also, and I really appreciate the question. I love asking that question. The filter that I put on that question is kind of like, what was the learning environment like for young people in these different spaces? And it might be a learning environment outside of school, or it might be in schools. I'll speak to the particular program that we've been talking about, student voice and leadership. And I also want to acknowledge and shout out the director and real innovator behind that program, so Alicia Lopez, who led that program for several years and really built it to be this thriving opportunity for students. And briefly, Kurt, though, because we've written about that question of kind of like, what is it about these social spaces and that enable young people to engage? The highlights I'll give are not going to be hugely surprising, but maybe they're still so important to mention. I mean, real strong sense of belonging or ways for students to find belonging might be a better way to say that. So creating the time and the space for students to kind of be both recognized as a member of that group, but also to find their sense of belonging and kind of claim it. I do think there's some real intentional efforts. I'm particularly thinking about some of the research that Bea and Carlos have done, because they've been doing some of the ethnographic work following some of the student clubs, where I'm thinking some of the kind of rituals that teams create to enable students to reflect on their own identities and kind of where they see their own identities in the projects that they're developing with each other. But I think first and foremost, I'll stop with this. I do think that even though these teams are all working on activist projects, they're trying to do things to, again, improve their school for their younger siblings, or improve, something about the educational experience. I think that they're often drawn to like just being in a supportive space with each other, where they feel recognized and they feel, affirmed as human beings. And I think when they have that strong sense of community with each other, it makes it a lot easier to be then motivated to kind of work on these projects. But I guess I would say the relationships come first. And we see oftentimes some of the most talented educators like slow down other parts of the project. So really emphasize this building of community. I'll pause there.
Anyone else?
I'll just add that community piece. That community piece seems to be really large in the groups that I've observed, to the point of a group leader in one of these youth organizations developed learning goals for his classmates. I know so-and-so needs to work on his public speaking. So my goal for him is by the end of the project, he will be our primary presenter. But that depth of knowledge of his fellow classmates. Now, if you would ask him about his style and his learning, he would call himself a slacker. I'm always falling behind on things. And I'm sitting there looking at, well, how did you develop as a student these goals for your fellow classmates if you're such a slacker or a screw up? Clearly you possess knowledge, but yes, that sense of community seems to absolutely be huge.
Thanks. We'll jump over to Chris, and then after Chris, we'll try and ask a couple audience questions. Chris, you want to jump in here?
Sure, Kurt, and your question was a nice bridge to what I wanted to bring up. One of our goals in Silver Lining for Learning is not only to celebrate innovations, but to see them as models that could be adapted and implemented elsewhere. And there may well be people in our live audience or people who will watch this later who will say, wow, I really want to make that happen here. So what advice would you give others about creating the kind of conditions under which this type of model could work? And also, to what extent is your model somewhat culture specific with these students? And in a different place, might the cultural dimensions of the model be somewhat different?
I'll say a couple things and invite here too my colleagues to speak up. Thanks for the question, Chris. First of all, one of the things that we've learned early on is that there's an unlearning that happens for adults to support this kind of transformative student voice. And it's an unlearning that I need to do. I'm continually doing it. And it's certainly an unlearning that the school personnel, I think, often are engaged in themselves. And so to answer your question about what is it needed to sort of, I think you might have said replicate or to kind of build this kind of model in other places, I would really include a strategy around adult kind of critical self-reflection and learning as part of that. And that's because we all need to be kind of we're trying to undo some of the patterns that we've perpetuated for decades, as Arturo was speaking to. Okay, so that's one that I think is really important. So there has to be a strategy around adult learning, and that's for the researchers as well. A second point that I really want to just share, as I guess a little bit more as like a publicizing for our own team, is that we have developed a lot of curricular resources that support this more open-ended, student-centered, and student-driven action research. It's very hard to kind of write conventional curriculum for work that's so emergent and unpredictable. We don't know what the topics are that students are going to select. So how do you develop kind of curricular resources that are kind of agnostic with regard to content, but still provide some structure and some scaffolding for students and or adult guides or adult facilitators? There are people who do that, who've done some good work, and we collaborate with them. We've developed one that we think is particularly useful in a school context that we call critical civic inquiry. And we'll throw the website link up with the webpage for this. I've shared it in our chat, Kurt. And I encourage people to go there and check it out. It's open access. People can remix it if they want. Anyway, so that's another, I guess that's a very concrete answer to your question, Chris, is just to say that we've been trying to learn from observing the brilliance of the teachers and the students and document practices, and then use that to kind of identify these core steps that we see typically followed to develop this open-ended inquiry cycle that culminates in some kind of critical action.
I'd love to highlight one point that I think Ben is really highlighting here, is that, you know, there's this pattern that has emerged within this project, but also in projects, you know, other projects that I've been on, which is creating new opportunities for how expertise can emerge and where it can be developed and who is an expert. So, you know, one of the essential things that we've been really playing with is how teachers can learn how to identify young people's expertise, and that they can potentially learn with young people. And when we sit in that space, it opens up new kinds of questions that can be examined in a classroom, that teachers and young people can examine together. One might be like, how is the coronavirus racially impacting our society? That's a very real question that no one has an answer to, that young people and teachers can really engage. However, it's really hard for teachers to learn how to do that, given the demands that are placed on them in their training, but also the demands that are placed on them as classroom teachers. So really, it's like, how do we continue to pick at the system that allows teachers to learn how to see young people as experts? One of the amazing things that young people are doing lately is that they're sharing their expertise in really profound ways that we need to learn how to catch up to. They're curating their lives using technological tools and transmedia in fascinating ways. And teachers have been leaning into that. And that's been really exciting to see how young people and teachers can learn together in these particular platforms. So this idea of shared expertise, distributed, how it emerges, that feels like a design principle, Kurt, that we can really lean into and figure out how can we scale that up across, maybe perhaps not scale, but spread across multiple ecologies.
We have an audience question. Gran Hilaire, I hope I'm saying it close. He says, I saw some increase in intergenerational learning in work that he did with Indigenous communities at the start of the pandemic. Did any of the panelists see similar occurrences? Intergenerational learning. B's shaking her head. Yeah, go ahead, B.
Sorry, I was gonna say, yes, we definitely did. One of the pieces that we highlighted in our article was the one of the students' family members was taking a class on how to become like a hairstylist. And so they learned kind of like the chemistry of hair and hair dyeing together, and really kind of working with one another of like, if I leave it on for this long, or if I mix this chemical with this chemical, right? Like it got pretty complex. And so I think there was some intergenerational learning. And I also think it depends on how and what we are seeing and defining as learning. Because I would argue that intergenerational learning is consistent and constant in certain homes, from something as simple or quote unquote simple as cooking, right? Like I was telling somebody, like, I am that person that you hate teaching you how to cook, because I'm like, yeah, you throw a little bit of this, throw a little bit of that. It depends on how it smells, right? But that is a learned technique That is something that you pick up. That is something that, when people are like, put a quarter tablespoon, I'm like, I don't know, I'll just like throw whatever feels good. And once it starts smelling good, like that's when I know it's ready. But those are the pieces that we don't talk about as learning, right? Like those are the pieces that we just assume and take for granted. And I think particularly our program at CU Denver, I want to give props to our professors in learning sciences, but they challenge us to think about how we think about learning and how and what we see as learning in particular. And so I would argue that there's always intergenerational learning going on. I think that we are, as researchers and as learning scientists, are learning to see that as learning. So, yeah.
I just want to quickly say, I love that last phrase you used, Bea, because that comes back to a lot of the issues that we're hearing about from students. Part of this is learning to see these phenomena or these experiences as learning. And it's making those visible. And that comes back to a question around were they being recognized by their schools for this, that kind of stuff. I would say, broadly speaking, it wasn't something that they were showing up, to their schools to get recognition for. But there's a process of learning to see these different kinds of experiences as learning. It's not about whether they're there or not, but whether we acknowledge it. Thanks for letting me.
So Ben,
I'll acknowledge the audience questions. Dazi, yes, it's authentic e-learning. I agree. All this is very much authentic. It's somewhat project-based or problem-based. We could talk probably for an hour about the components thereof, but we've kind of hit all those. Young's got a question. Young, jump in here.
Well, I was just going to follow Ben and actually more Chris, because we've been talking about models, and I'm sure, you guys, when you do literature review, you will see there are probably thousands of similar projects in different parts of the world, so we call them silos of success, so we've seen a lot of them. If you go to like the Learn and Brain conference, you can present, oh my God, this is amazing. So I'm quite very, impressed with your projects. So Ben, and actually everyone can answer this question. You can just speculate, how do we make this truly a model? Similar models, student agency, student voice, student, we call self-determination. There's a lot of theories behind all of this. I'm just really asking you guys from your own perspective to say, how do we get schools to accept? There is a revolution in learning at this moment. How we define learning, what learning matters, what, like Chris talked about disposition, think about. So how do we really bring this to a broader context, at least, forcing the state of Colorado to accept, to reduce 1/3 of its curriculum and the state, and they accept another 1/3 of our students' self-learning as learning. Do you guys have any ideas, thoughts? Feel free to use the big words like bullshit. That's acceptable. Like Chris said.
Well, one of the things I'll start off with is saying I think our CCI model can work across disciplines. Oftentimes it gets labeled as civic. We've seen really profound growth in literacy classes, for example. Two of our teachers that have been in literacy backgrounds that have used this kind of student voice model turn around and see tremendous gains in their students' literacy scores. So one of them is thinking about how do we infuse this kind of student voice and student-led inquiry across disciplines. So that's where I'll get us started with.
And I'll just say, I think it's such an important question, Young, and we've been asking ourselves that question at a slightly smaller scale, but within one school district, what does it look like to really deepen and sustain this work and spread it and scale it? And so we've been thinking about that question a lot, and it's a long answer, but one thing that I liked about asking that question in Denver was that some of the most effective examples of kind of building that model or deepening or sustaining that model in a particular school that held onto its critical edge was students themselves fighting for it. So in other words, we were asked, and with support from the Hewlett Foundation, I should give them some credit, we were asked to look at what does it take to scale this kind of student-centered, kind of critical student voice program. And there's all kinds of things we can say, but we have some really powerful examples at specific school sites that it was student teams themselves, like meeting with their principal or building support from a set of teachers to maybe, instead of it being an after school class that only some students could come to, like making it a class in the curriculum that was still an elective. It wasn't bound by certain sort of standards, but it created a space in the school that they knew it'd be going on for years to come. So that's just one little example, is that you can't engineer that. Like you can't just, shake a wand and say, students, you make this scale. But it was really interesting to see how emergent that was. So when we talk about scaling, I guess in our theories, we need to think about where is there space for people who are experiencing these curricular changes to be advocating for them, and how can there be emergent organizing in support of some of these changes? That kind of a grassroots way of thinking about school level change.
I love that. I want to build on that, because I think that I think what you're highlighting, Ben, is something that is probably a little unsettling for some of us on this call. It's really, we have to play the long game. That feels like that needs to be part of a model. Oftentimes we want these quick fixes. We want a curriculum that is in a binder that we can implement tomorrow, but I think we need to figure out how to play the long game as well. So yes, you asked this question about intergenerational change, but how do we plan for generational change across generations? What is our role in terms of thinking distinctly temporally? How are we playing this? How are we thinking about this in decades into the future? Young people are really the holders of that. They're the ones who are really trying to endow and bestow all of these new skills and capacities. So in addition to that, I think we need to think ecologically. This is not just a model for transforming K-12 schooling. This is about transforming institutions, society, including university-based teacher education, including the spaces that support parents and community organizations. But if we wanted some strategies, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news and say doom and gloom, we have to play the long game. I think that there are some, and it's really this, leaning into that intergenerational question is fascinating to me. What does it mean to intentionally design learning environments that bring together young people, teachers, administrators, researchers, and community members? Our learning environments are age segregated. We don't allow for folks to build across generations. In addition to that, we don't allow for them to build across species. Because I think that we've been really focused on human learning here. And what ways can we learn with our non-human siblings? This is really important for us, especially within the context of climate change. So I really think that, not only is it about playing the long game, but it's also about really rethinking learning and where it can potentially happen and who can be there.
Yeah, and I would like to add one more thing of, I think one of the big pieces of how do we make this work is how do we as adults and the people who have quote unquote power, how do we learn to acknowledge and recognize and become responsive to expertise that is within our community, whether it's students, whether it's parents, whether it's historical knowledge that may not come up or may be hidden. I think of one of the biggest pushes here in Denver is how do we bring in ethnic studies, and we don't acknowledge the huge role that the Chicanx movement had in the 60s in Denver, or the very historical Black neighborhoods that are being torn down and gentrified, and that impact that is causing on families, and that intergenerational trauma that it's becoming, and how we're erasing them, and that response and how that is affecting families. And those responses aren't there in the curriculum. And so it's like, not only is history being erased, it's being erased in the school and in the system. So it's like, how do we respond to those pains, to that lack of voice, to that agency being taken away from folks? And I think that is very, very specific to the town, the city, the state. And I think that makes it really hard, because it's like, oh man, but if we had like this one curriculum that fixed it all, and it's like, no, we have this curriculum, but it's going to look very different in different places because of what is going on in that community.
Thank you very much, Bea and Ben and Arturo and Carlos. It's been a wonderful conversation for the past hour. I wanted to talk to you about the future and what you haven't done yet, but if people are interested in that, their emails are listed in the blog post. I added that. If you got the blog post early, you might not have gotten their emails, but it's in there now. So I want to end episode 89 with just a big thank you and end day 666 of Silver Lining for Learning. And a big round of applause, and then turn it over to Chris to introduce our next show. So Chris, take it over.
Chris, before you start, just one quick thing. I saw a lot of links were shared. They went on the YouTube channel as well. Do you mind dropping an email to either Kurt or me, and then we can put them on the blog post as well? Because you guys shared a lot of resources that would be good as an archival on the website. So thanks. Yeah. Chris, go ahead.
Well, I want to join the rest of us in thanking you for just a terrific episode. I'm very excited about next week as well. The focus is on scaling and sustaining high-quality computer science education, and in particular, making it accessible to many groups that have been marginalized. Our guest experts are two Harvard alumni. One is also a former student of mine at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And not only have they built these scaled, not just scalable, but scaled philanthropic programs, but they also have worn a variety of shoes, including being on a state board of education. So they'll be sharing some of their adventures with you.